In 2016, David Remnick, writing in The New Yorker, said this about the Oscars. Quote, about 10 years ago, Louis Menand reviewed a book about the history of literary prizes. He discovered that people have always argued about them. In fact, those arguments are the point. No prize committee ever gets it right. But by getting it wrong, by passing over Tolstoy for the first Nobel Prize in Literature, for example, prizes give the rest of us a chance to talk about the art that matters to us. The same principle is at work with the Oscars. The conversations they spark are often more interesting than the awards themselves. End quote. I love the Oscars. I love them because they give me some insight into the films I may have missed. So I get myself off the couch and go see them. Today's film is an example of that. It is a film that neither Tess nor I would probably have seen if it hadn't been an Oscar contender. So here we go.
Hello and welcome to Woman Inherits the Earth, a mother-daughter podcast about the representation of women in movies and television. I am Tessa Dare, a writer and the author of the paranormal mystery series The Karanzan Chronicles, and Beth's daughter.
And I am Beth Van Buren, Tessa's mother and also a writer. In this podcast, we discuss women in film. Today, we are discussing Conclave. Spoiler alert, we strongly encourage you to see this movie before listening to our podcast. We will be discussing important plot points and the ending. And this is a movie where it's important you don't know the ending going into it. So, just to give a brief summary of the film, it's basically very similar to the 1960s movie with Anthony Quinn, In the Shoes of the Fisherman, in that it's a story about the Catholic conclave where the College of Cardinals democratically selects a new pope. The main character is Father Lawrence, who is the dean of the College of Cardinals and manages the process. The story mostly revolves around the voting and selection of the new pope. It starts with the death of the old one. It ends with the selection of the new one. That's a basic summary. I'm also going to summarize some of the crises that happen in the movie because this is a movie that the pace of it revolves around these various crises.
Yeah.
The first one is that Father Tremblay has been fired for gross misconduct. We find this out very early in the film, but it has not been publicized. It didn't go into effect because the Pope died. So Father Lawrence, who is the dean of the college, learns of it just a few minutes before they are sequestered. The second crisis is that a new cardinal has been named to the college. The Archbishop of Kabul has been elevated by the Pope according to the rule of in pectore, but he keeps it a secret to keep the cardinal safe because he's from Kabul, Afghanistan.
I think he's actually from South America, but he's working in Kabul.
He is.
Yeah.
And he's worked in a couple of war-torn areas, which is what his background is. He goes into areas that are experiencing trauma and chaos, and that's where he has done his work.
Actually, I guess he's from Mexico, which is technically Central America. Sorry, correcting myself.
Okay. The third crisis is that the front runner for and by that I mean the cardinal who's getting the most votes, who is black and from Nigeria. It's discovered that he fathered a child 30 years before, which might be something he could ordinarily overcome, but he did it with a nun who was 11 years younger than him at the time, which meant that she was a teenager at the time.
She was 19 at the time.
And that's pretty young. So the fourth crisis, so he's out of the running. So that's the third crisis. The fourth crisis is there is a huge explosion that halts voting. It's outside of where they are in the Sistine, but it explodes several of the windows and injures several of the cardinals in the room and kills 52 people outside, and it shuts down the conclave temporarily. Mm-hmm. So the fifth crisis is we go back to Father Cardinal Tremblay, who it is confirmed he has committed gross misconduct after Father Lawrence has done some investigating. We'll talk about what that misconduct is later on. And the sixth and final crisis happens after the vote. at the very end of the movie, and it is a reveal, and it is not one that actually has a resolution.
Yeah.
So,
and we'll talk about that towards the end of our discussion, because that's kind of where we want to end on.
Yeah. So the movie is Conclave. It was made in 2024, directed by Edward Berger, written by Peter Strahan, Straughan, and Robert Harris, based on Harris's book, running time of 2 hours, starring Rafe Fiennes, Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow, and Isabella Rossellini. And those are the top billed actors, although Isabella Rossellini has a very small role, which we will talk about later. Yeah. So go ahead.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, the background, sort of the historical background. The film is fictional, but it is inspired by the 2005 papal conclave, at least to some extent. That was when Pope John Paul II died, and they had to find a new pope. And the liberal contender for the papacy was a cardinal named Carlo Maria Martini, and the much more conservative contender was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the conservative, eventually won. He became Pope Benedict XVI, and he's German, which I bring up because in the movie today, the character Aldo Bellini, who's Stanley Tucci's character, is believed to be based on Carlo Maria Martini, the liberal contender who lost out to the conservative. And the Italian conservative contender in the movie is named Tedesco. I have no expertise in Catholicism, but I do speak Italian, and Tedesco is the Italian word for German. So he's an Italian, he's an Italian character, but his name is essentially the German, and he's kind of the stand-in for the man who became Pope Benedict XVI. Anyway, so that's just sort of a little bit of trivia, and that's kind of, like I said, the film is fictional, but it's to a certain extent inspired by this story where a popular liberal contender eventually lost out to a conservative contender, which if you know that going into it, that, makes you very concerned that Tedesco is going to ultimately win the day because he's the conservative contender. He's essentially the Cardinal Ratzinger character. I don't know if he bears any other similarity. I just know that his name means German. But we do know a lot about his character. He's basically the movie's stand-in for the conservative wing of the church, or at least the European conservative wing of the church, because he's very explicitly kind of racist. He explicitly wants to return to all Latin masses, which, I've heard this argument before, and it always strikes me as weird coming from people who are native English speakers, but I will say it makes a lot more sense to me coming from a native Italian speaker, because, again, as someone who speaks Italian and who also took 2 years of Latin and got an award on the National Latin exam, Italian and Latin are very similar languages. They are just barely different. I mean, they are different, but they're very, very similar. So I feel like this was one of the first times that I really viscerally felt, oh yeah, it makes sense why Italians want everyone to go back to Latin Mass. It's not that big of a shift for them.
No, and actually, there's a lot of kind of trivial history involved in here. As with almost every country on the planet, the Catholic Church, which is, going back a little bit, the Pope is not just the head of the Catholic Church. He's also the head of state for the Vatican. He is democratically elected by the cardinals, if you can call a small group of men electing the leader to be democratic. But with every single country on the planet, there is a liberal and a conservative faction in the Catholic Church, and including in the cardinals and in the priesthood. The Organization of American Bishops has struggles between liberals and conservatives. We should point it out that Tess and I, neither one of us were raised Catholic. We're not an expert on Catholicism, but my mother did train a little bit. She almost converted to Catholicism, so she learned a little bit about some things, and she always stayed on top of news about the Catholic Church when we were growing up, and she would tell me things. So one of the things I know is that the Pope that they are talking about in one of the scenes where they talk about his robes, and I forget what they called it, being they had to slice the robes on the back because he was a large man. That's Pope John, and he was Pope at around the time John Kennedy was president. And a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, I'm not sure the exact years, but he was a liberal for that time. He was a liberal Pope. He is the Pope responsible. Most people consider the Pope to be responsible for bringing the church kind of into the modern era. He stopped the Latin masses. Now, some churches continued to do their masses in Latin, but I think he made it a rule that it didn't have to happen. You could do them in English. You could do them in Spanish if you were in a Spanish area.
Boy, I'm just going to show my whole ass about how little, how uncertain I am when it comes to Catholicism. But they call something Vatican II. That was the name for when they made a bunch of these decisions.
That is exactly it. There have been a couple of Vatican, what were those called? They're I don't know.
Ecclesiastical meetings or something.
No, it's a conference. They get together and they vote on canonical changes, basically. Yeah. So Vatican II was the one that I think, and they did a lot of other things too. Women they were given more of a role in the church, although they still could not become priests, and that continues to be a big issue amongst Catholics. But the other thing that to keep in mind here that's going on in here with the two Italian cardinals, Tedesco and Bellini, is for hundreds of years. I mean, for multiple centuries, maybe 4 centuries, 5. Every pope was Italian. The head of the church is based in Italy. They were always Italian. And it's just in the last 40 to 50 years that other nationalities have been represented with popes. And even then, it's not been, there was Benedictine, like you said, it was German. Was he German?
He was German. And I think John Paul II was Polish.
Yes, he was. Yeah. And the current pope is, I'm not sure what his nationality is, but he comes from South America. He served his priesthood in South America, but he does speak a pretty accurate Italian. So he may be Italian and went there. I don't really know, but anyway, it's been a pull between Italians who wanted Italian priests and people in the rest of the world who wanted non-Italian priests. So they kind of, to me, in my mind, represent that pull, the two of them. And one of them's liberal and one of them's conservative.
Yeah, the current Pope Francis is from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Apparently he's the first pope born and raised outside of Europe since the 8th century when we had a Syrian pope.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
and there's never been a black pope. There's never been an American pope. Mm-hmm. I mean, there has been. He's South American, and that's as close as we've gotten so far, which is interesting when you consider that the largest number, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but the largest number of Catholics in the world are probably found in this country because we have such a large population. You're not going to find a whole lot of Catholics in Russia or China.
True, but I do think South America might actually be where the highest number.
But that's a continent.
That's a continent. That's true. Yeah. So I don't know if there any individual, but Brazil has a huge population. So if I were going to put my money on a single country, I'd probably go with Brazil.
Yeah, it's hugely. So that's just my anecdotal understanding of the Catholic Church over my lifetime, and so all of those things I had in my mind were in my mind while I was watching the movie.
I just want to talk about, as someone who speaks Italian but does not natively speak Italian, it's always very funny to me when I watch a movie where there's a lot of Italian. I mean, if I watch an actual movie made in Italy where it's all native speakers speaking Italian, my experience is basically I will catch one word per sentence and know what that is, but I absolutely cannot watch it without subtitles. I mean, I could, but I would not know what's going on. I'd probably get the gist of it mostly from performances. But a movie like this, which was not really made by Italians and where a lot of the Italian is spoken by non-native Italian speakers, I could actually understand a lot of it. I think I could have understood almost every single one of Ray Fiennes' lines in Italian without the subtitles, because he speaks it slow enough that I can hear it. And I will say, I think he had a really good accent. Like, I don't he did a good job pronouncing it. Yeah, I don't want to say that I'm an expert on it, but like, as someone who has taken Italian, I felt like he did a really good job.
Yeah, and shout out to him, because he had to memorize huge sections of Italian and speak them, without reading cue cards.
Yeah, for
sure.
So
it was amazing.
But yeah, I thought he did a really good job pronouncing it. The guy who plays Tedesco is Sergio Castellito. I could not necessarily understand him quite as well. I mean, obviously he had a much more authentic Italian accent. He's clearly an actual Italian person, but he also spoke really fast. I feel like
he was often angry.
He was often, very expressive. I feel like still not quite as fast as when you watch an actual Italian movie. Italians talk fast. That is just a thing that they do.
They're famous for that. Yeah.
But I feel like he was trying to slow down to fit into this movie, but it was still a little bit too fast for me. It's a movie where there's a lot of Italian. I got to talk about Italian a little bit. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the character of Cardinal Adeyemi, and kind of the way that they talk about him and the way that they talk about politics in relation to him. We mentioned this a little bit when we were going over kind of the crises. Tedesco is the Italian traditionalist / conservative. Adeyemi is kind of a different kind of conservative. He's definitely still a conservative, but obviously he's the Nigerian candidate. So with him, the issue isn't really like racism and gatekeeping like it is with Tedesco. Because I guess I should say, when it comes to Tedesco, it's not exactly straightforward racism the way that we understand it in America. He specifically couches it in these terms when he's talking to Lawrence. He says, look at how all of the different language-speaking groups have organized themselves along these lines. And he kind of implies that that's natural and not necessarily something that should really be fought. But the undercurrent is, because the native Italian speakers should be the ones who are in charge. When it comes to Adeyemi, obviously it's not really the same kind of racist thing that's happening, but they do say a couple of times that he has really conservative social views and that he has specifically basically said that he thinks gays should be put to death and then burn in hell. So it's a very virulent form of homophobia. And again, not an expert on Nigeria, but my father-in-law is Nigerian, and my partner tells me that this is a pretty common viewpoint among Catholic Nigerians. There is a lot of very virulent homophobia in that area, specifically among the Catholics, because, as we've talked about a little bit, one of the dark sides to Catholicism is that it has spread throughout the world alongside colonialism in a very colonialist way. It has come into impoverished or cut off countries or communities that don't have the resources to defend themselves against the big, strong, super wealthy Catholic Church coming in and kind of taking over and forcing themselves to become a part of culture. And that has allowed a lot of homophobia to flourish in a lot of areas where it otherwise might not be there. I mean, it's hard to say because we can't know what the world would look like without the influence of the Catholic Church. But that is a thing that is happening here. Cardinal Adeyemi, there's definitely a contention. He's one of the front runners at the beginning to becoming the next pope. And before they start talking about it, you think, oh, that might be really cool. It would be really cool to have a Nigerian pope. Yeah. That would feel like a move towards equality. But unfortunately, he's a hardline homophobe. And so we see a lot of the liberals in the church talking to each other and kind of strategizing about basically how to keep the church from going hard right in the election. And Adeyemi's homophobia is a big part of it.
He's also a hypocrite.
Yes.
He impregnated a 19-year-old girl when he was a priest and then tried to cover it up for years. And so it's okay to have, the Catholic Church has taught for years and years, forever, that sex should be confined to marriage. That abortion is wrong. There are lots of things like that. You shouldn't use birth control. So he is a pope who is, or not a pope, a priest at this point. He's 30 years old when he impregnates this 19-year-old. So he is a priest at this point who has taken vows of chastity. Yeah. And he impregnates this 19-year-old girl and then hides it. Mm-hmm. And if he were doing the right thing, if he were truly living his religion, he would have quit the priesthood and married her, because that's what Catholics stand for. So he didn't do that. He's a hypocrite. And yet he is standing in judgment of gay and lesbian people across the world and saying that is so horrific a behavior that they should be killed and sent to hell. How do you even begin to take that seriously from a man who could basically rape a young woman? Because 19, and he was 30, that's rape. So... And if he was a priest at that point, when he held some power and some authority in their areas. So of course she succumbed to him. Of course she did. And I think the implication is that there may have been other women who did so as well. So it's okay to uphold some of the laws of Catholicism, but not others. That's the nature of hypocrisy.
And we, the viewer, never get to see her talk about it. Lawrence gets her to talk about it by taking her confession, and then we cut to the next scene. So we never see her talk about it. But she seems very upset by his presence. What little we see of her reaction...
She seemed in fear for her life.
Yes.
She wasn't just upset. Seemed like she was fearful.
Yeah, she was trembling. Yeah, she was afraid. To me, it gave me the impression that she was traumatized by her whole experience with him. It's hard to say for sure, but at the very least, he was in power. He was older than her. It was definitely a coercive situation. And then he abandoned the child who was a result of this. And so, it's like, it's not just that he had sex outside of wedlock. It's not even just that it seems like it was at least assault, if not rape. It's also that he abandoned that child. And then in his defense of himself, he seemed to think that was a good thing. When he's talking to Lawrence and he's trying to convince Lawrence that he should still be a candidate for the papacy, he says, well, this child doesn't even know who I am. You just have to stop and you're like, okay, I get the part of what you're saying is that means that you can keep it a secret, but dude, you're also trying to argue that this was a long time ago and you shouldn't be held accountable for a single mistake you made a long time ago. I'm sorry, as long as that child lives and does not know who you are continuing to make a bad decision, an immoral decision. You are responsible for the life of this child.
The title of the first movie, In the Shoes of the Fisherman, comes out of the story of, I think it's Peter, who was the first pope. He was a fisherman. He was a simple man. So priests take vows of chastity and humility. And this man is just the opposite of humble.
Very prideful.
If he had made this mistake, well, first of all, if he was humble, he wouldn't have made this mistake with this young girl. After having made that mistake, if he had come forward and admitted it and apologized and gone to his superiors in the church and said, what do I need to do to what's the word I want, to atone for my sins? I have sinned. What do I do now? If he had done that, I guess I'm assuming they placed the child with an adoptive family. Isn't that what they said they did?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. So if he had been humble about that at all and admitted it was a mistake all along from the very beginning, it might have been a different situation. At this point, it's just covering his ass. He's covering his ass because he wants to be pope. And that's something else we should talk about here for just a second. I think it's Bellini who says every priest has it in the back of his mind that someday he could be the pope. Even if you don't want it, even if you think you could never do it, you still have an idea of what you would name yourself if you became pope. Father Lawrence says he doesn't have a name picked out if he's selected, but Bellini does. And even though he's not sure he wants it, he's upfront about that from the very beginning. He's not sure he can live with the politics and the hypocrisy because he's a good person, but he also doesn't want the liberal side to lose. So he pushes forward with his candidacy, but he completely and honestly admits that he would love to be pope and what his papal name would be. Here's another thing that I wrote down before we get to some of the other things. Bellini and Lawrence have a conversation at the beginning of the film about where Bellini tells him. So Bellini and Lawrence were pretty close to this pope who has died.
Yes.
They were both in his circle of friends. And the Pope shared with Bellini that he had been having a crisis of faith. And he had not shared that with Lawrence. And I think it looks a little bit like a betrayal to Lawrence that he didn't share it with him.
Yeah.
But the reason it comes up is that Lawrence is saying that he's had a bit of a crisis too, which is why he doesn't think he can be Pope. But his crisis is that he's having trouble praying. And we don't really spend a lot of time on that. But since this is a film full of a sequence of crises, I think crisis of faith, crises in the world, interpersonal, individual, private crises are a big theme in this movie. So for him to share with him that the Pope had a crisis of faith is interesting. And then as things unfold through the process of selecting a new Pope, we kind of begin to understand why he might have had that crisis of faith, because the cardinals around him are failing him left and right.
Yeah.
They have taken these vows as priests and not lived up to them. So that's another big part of it.
Yeah, and towards the end, Lawrence tells someone, I don't remember who he's talking to, but he tells someone that he thinks, because he had gone to the Pope and tried to resign as deacon to go back to just being a priest, and the Pope wouldn't let him, and he eventually confides to someone that he thinks it's because he suspected that he was going to die and that there was going to be this contentious conclave, and he wanted Lawrence to shepherd it, essentially.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's the only time we really hear about that, but several comments are made that nobody really knew he was sick. Even Bellini, who
was really close to him,
yeah, and told him that he was having a crisis of faith, didn't know he was sick, but apparently he was. Now, the one person who might have known was Wojciech, and he's the aide to the Pope. So the Pope has, the dean of the college. He has several attendants, I guess, that manage his affairs and take care of him. He has a personal attendant, and I think that's Wojciech. And so he is his closest aide and is devastated by the Pope's death and is drinking heavily at the beginning of the film, and then walks off, leaves the conclave, and we don't see him really again. So
he's not a cardinal, so I think he's
an archbishop,
he can't interact with them. He's not authorized to interact with them.
There are several archbishops that stay outside of the conclave and take care of their needs. And then they also bring in all these nuns to take care of their needs, which is where Isabella Rossellini comes in, because she is in charge of the nuns who are doing the cooking and cleaning and taking care of. And here's another interesting thing visually about this movie is that apparently they have this whole dormitory set up for the College of Cardinals, just so they can get together every however many decades it takes for a pope to live and die and have this conclave. I mean, it has been built specifically for this, and these are nice rooms. I mean, these are large bedrooms. So they don't have a lot of stuff in it. They're kind of, that whole vow of poverty and is obvious in there. They each have a little coffee machine, and they have an espresso machine, I should say, because it's Italy, and they have a bathroom.
It's called the Domus Sancti Marthae. And actually this kind of brings up a point that I wanted to make about the production, because I had this question on and off throughout the film. I didn't know where the conclave met. They do meet in the Sistine Chapel, but like they were in the room. I've been to the Sistine Chapel, and they kept doing these shots where they would show a part of the painting, but it was never like the main part of the painting. So I was like, I'm pretty sure they're in the Sistine Chapel, but it looks a little bit off. You cannot film inside the Sistine Chapel. I mean, so I've been to the Sistine Chapel, and you're not allowed to take photos when you go. You can go. Yeah. But
okay, so I did look this up. They filmed it in a variety of locations in Italy and on studio sets in Cinecittà.
Cinecittà. It's Cinecittà.
Okay. They used CGI to recreate the Vatican, and I'm assuming the Sistine, because you can't film in there, as you said.
You can't film in there.
They did their homework. There are turtles living in the Vatican gardens. They really did their homework on this.
Yeah.
And some of the scenes were filmed at the Royal Palace of Caserta. So C is a hard C, Caserta, which is north of Naples.
Caserta,
And that beautiful white staircase that they're coming down at some point, that was in the royal palace of Caserta.
Yeah,
so,
and
so none of it was filmed in the Vatican.
And the same with the dorm that you were talking about. They also recreated that, and apparently they intentionally they based it on the real one, but they intentionally made it look a little bit more prison-like to increase. I guess what we've skipped past that people may know or they may not know, when the conclave meets, the cardinals go into seclusion, which means that they're not really allowed to interact with the outside world. That's kind of why we're talking about this.
And yet they do several times.
And yet they do, true.
During the course of the film. So here's my biggest problem with the film. And maybe they considered this and just decided to let it go. But there are a lot of people in this world who are not Catholic. So you should have explained some of these things. So in the Fisherman, the thing that I like about it is how they structure the storytelling. There's a reporter, a journalist covering this whole thing, and he explains things as you go along in the film. You should see this film. It's a fascinating film, well acted. Anthony Quinn is wonderful, but he interjects things periodically. He'll say they're doing this now, this is what this means, because he understands that the rest of the world is not Catholic and doesn't know. So this film goes through these actions but doesn't explain them. And you just kind of have to figure things out. So sometimes they're sequestered and sometimes they're not. So when Wojciech tells him that, I'm saying that name wrong because I
think there's an N in it, but I remember that he calls him Janus or something, or Janus, which I think is his first name, but I don't remember how he pronounces his last name.
Janus, yeah,
Janus.
It's definitely his first. Let's just go with Janus then, because I'm never going to pronounce that last name correctly. Okay, so when Janus leaves, he tells him, before he leaves, he tells Father Lawrence all of this, and Father Lawrence says, well, there's nothing I can do about this now. We're about to be sequestered. Then they go into sequestration, but then apparently they come out of it, and he does send somebody out to find the priest who apparently was in the room and knows why Tremblay was fired, basically. So at some point they come out of sequestration. My understanding is that's not the case. But then when you think about it, if this is going to go on for weeks, and sometimes it does go on for weeks, they do have to come out periodically. And so they take their meals in a place that I think is part of the sequestration. But then they get their motor bused to, what were you calling it? The
Domus Sancti Marthi.
They take a bus there. It's like a van, big van, and they all get bused there and back. And some of the visuals involved in that are amazing. So when they first arrive, you may have noticed this, this is a scene where all the cardinals are walking in their red robes and their black umbrellas. So then about 80% into the film, they have gone to their dorm, whatever, I'm just going to call it their dormitory, and they're coming back and it's raining again, and they again got their red robes on, and they have white umbrellas.
White umbrellas, yeah.
It's like a sea of penguins in both cases, walking together because they're waddling in these big robes, but you've got black umbrellas the first time and white umbrellas the second time, and it's a marvelous dichotomy, I guess, or contrast. But why?
Yeah. So the character that Cardinal Lawrence talks to is Monsignor Raymond O'Malley, and I just sort of took it as the Monsignor had like a special position where he could talk to the people in sequestration and go outside. Like I said, I'm not a Catholic. He's not a cardinal. I have no idea how realistic this is. I have no idea what the actual rules are.
O'Malley seems to be his secretary, the dean's secretary. They don't say that, but that's what it feels like to me. So he's able to go out. You're right. He's never sequestered, but Father Lawrence does have to talk to him.
Yes.
So that means he is coming out of sequestration to ask him these questions. So if they would just explain this, it would be fine. But to me, it's just like, you just said at the beginning of the film that there's nothing you can do about this because you're going to be sequestered. But then you come out and talk to O'Malley and send him off to do this investigation for you.
Yeah.
How are you talking to him if you're sequestered?
Well, and that actually, I feel like that kind of brings me to, I wanted to talk a little bit about Cardinal Lawrence as a character. This is Ray Fiennes' character, and ostensibly he's the main character of the movie. He's an interesting guy, because he is kind of this constant contradiction throughout the movie. Because like you just said, he's supposed to be sequestered, and he even says to O'Malley, like, don't tell me what's going on with the bombing because I'm not supposed to know either. But then later on, he's like, actually, do tell me. And that's kind of how he approaches everything. It's like he's, I mean, I think he is kind of for this movie, he's the soul of the church, torn between the demands of modernity and the demands of tradition. You know, that's essentially what this movie is about. We're talking about the conservatives versus the liberals. To an extent, we're talking about tradition versus modernity. And that is the point where Lawrence sits as well. He definitely leans towards the liberal side, but, you know, he repeatedly, people keep voting for him for Pope, and he's, like, flustered by this. He does not want to be Pope. You know, Bellini, the Tucci character, insists that everyone wants to be Pope, but I kind of believe, Lawrence, that he does not want to be Pope. He doesn't
until he has no choice.
Yeah, until he has no choice. It
comes to a point where he has no choice, yeah.
Yeah, he does not want to have the responsibility rest in him. He doesn't think he's good enough for it. And similarly,
it's because the people who think they are good enough for this, to be the Pope or to be the president, typically have such egos that they are really not qualified for these roles. People who are not qualified or who are qualified for the roles don't seek them. That's the contradiction in elected office and in leadership throughout history. And I think you're right. Lawrence embodies his conflict. He has a short speech at one point, and he's certainly the poetic soul of the film. Yeah, I wrote it down. He said, quote, "Certainty is the great enemy of unity and the deadly enemy of tolerance. Even Christ was not certain at the end. Our faith is a living thing precisely because it walks hand in hand with doubt. If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery and therefore no need for faith. Let us pray that God sends us a Pope who doubts." Yeah. So, and that's actually really crucial to the end of the film. I mean, we'll come back to that when we talk about the end of the film. But he is the poetic center of this film, and Ralph Fiennes does a fantastic job. Yeah. You know, I'm a fan anyway. I love him. I think I have never seen a single Ralph Fiennes role where he wasn't brilliant and my jaw would just drop at what he was doing. I think in his personal life, he's not such a great guy sometimes. And that's kind of interesting as well. I did some reading about him. But he is such a brilliant actor. And we are recording, listeners, the day after the Oscars, and we know that he did not win the Best Actor award, which is a shame, because I think I haven't seen the other acting roles, so I don't know for sure, I can't say 100%, but wow, he just really, he was amazing.
He did do a great job. But yeah, so the other thing that kind of keeps happening with Lawrence is he keeps being presented with evidence that some of the cardinals in contention have these secrets that might really mess with the church if they become elected Pope. And he keeps saying that he doesn't want to investigate and then going ahead and investigating.
He does, but it's a doubt. He's got this doubt.
Yes.
And he has to explore his doubts, and he never gives up on that.
And I should say, when he says he doesn't want to investigate, it's almost like a proprietary thing for him. He's not sure that it's appropriate for him to investigate, but eventually the investigation begs to happen. He's caught between this desire to respect the institution and the other side of respecting the institution, which is making sure that only the best people end up with the job.
And the sins of these people are significant. These two men that get pushed out of the running, they have committed significant sins in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And he says to them, this is not my decision. I'm not telling you that you have to pull out of the race or, drop out of the process. I am telling you that if you become Pope, you will destroy the church with these secrets. Yeah. If this information comes out, and it will somewhere, somehow come out. They have to face that certainty.
I only really have two other things that I want to talk about, and this feels like a good time to mention that I was a little bit bored at the beginning of this movie, which I actually think is ultimately a testament to the strength of it, because by the end, I was very invested. When I saw the trailer, I was like, well, I like a lot of these actors, and it certainly looks like it's been well made, and I love Italy. I basically convinced myself to watch this movie because the Vatican is a beautiful place, and it's a lot of really beautiful cinematography. But at the beginning, I kind of felt like, oh boy, this is going to be a 2-hour movie about old men gossiping about each other. And it kind of is, but I did get invested.
Yeah.
And I think for
and it's
a
all
person,
men. It's also
it is all men.
It's all men. But it's all men, and you and I typically don't like movies that are just about men. We typically kind of just don't even watch them most of the time. Neither one of us saw Oppenheimer, so we're not really big fans of movies that have no women in them. This one pretty much completely has no women in it. So yeah.
And for me, especially movies that seem like they're going to lionize patriarchal institutions and hold up this kind of myth of the savior genius man. But I do think ultimately this movie did not quite do that. I definitely think this movie has no interest in saying that any individual person is a savior genius who's going to save the world. But I'm not a Catholic, and it's the year 2025, and at the beginning of this movie, I was like, I get that electing the Pope is important for Catholics, but we are acting like this is like a presidential election, and I'm sorry, it's just not. The Pope is an important cultural figure, but he hasn't, as my partner said, it's not like he's got nukes, and it's not like he's got control of the economy.
No, but it's an allegory. I mean, it's this leadership story, but it's every leadership story.
My point is, I actually think this is a testament to how good the filmmaking is and how it slowly rolls out the intrigue, because I was ultimately not that interested in what the story was about, because I don't care about the election of the Pope. I don't. I'm an atheist. I live in America. I think the Vatican is beautiful, and I love Italy, and I love a lot of the art and the beauty there, but I'm not religious, and this is not something that matters to me. But the film made it matter to me in very interesting, subtle ways, and a lot of that has to do with the character of Benitez and a little bit with Isabella Rossellini's character, but honestly I think Benitez's character is much more what pulled me into the film, and we haven't really talked about him much yet.
Well, we will. So I think Aldo Bellini is the one that first brings me into it, because until he gets his little speech, Lawrence is pretty much the focus of the film. And he is a straightforward guy, a straight shooter. He's honest. He is conflicted. But he is very much the man who holds up the traditions. I mean, that's what his role is. The dean of the College of Cardinals holds up the ceremonial traditions of the church. That's his role in this film. And yet he is disrupted in that role over and over and over again throughout the film, and he is changing, as that happens. And this is also a film about change and how that happens in society. But the story does build, and I think what caught me up in it was that even though these are men, even though they are men whose careers, are religious authoritarianism, essentially, because priests are considered like little mini kings in their kingdoms. That's been my experience. I actually worked for the Catholic Church years ago as a teenager, and I saw it firsthand then. Priests are revered as kings in their little kingdoms, little fiefdoms. And so even though it's all these men and they're priests, they are still humans, and their stories come through. And even though you see these two men who have done really awful things, simony, is that what it's called? When it's revealed that simony. Okay, so when it's revealed that Tremblay has committed simony, he's purchased other priests' votes. He's paid them to vote for him, and then the other guy has basically raped and impregnated a young girl. So these are horrible acts, and yet both of these men come off after they've been, they're experiencing shame. They're going to be kicked out of the priesthood, probably both of them. They have lost everything, and they suddenly look very human to us. Of course, the actors are very good. John Lithgow is, we should say this, John Lithgow is playing Tremblay. He is extraordinary in this role. And when he realizes he's lost everything, you can just see the horror and the sadness and the sorrow on his face. And he's done this to himself. And so has, what is that, Adirian?
Adeyemi.
Same with him. And he actually breaks down and cries and sobs for many minutes. And they're human. all of these priests are human. Some of them are good, some of them are not good. We like some of them, we don't like others, but their human story is so real and so full of pathos, you can't help but relate. It's relatable. It's very relatable. And I think the filmmaker, I don't know this filmmaker, but he does a great job with that. And
he does.
It's just the storytelling and the visual storytelling, which we should get to in a few minutes.
Yeah.
The whole thing is just gorgeous.
I will say, I'm not sure that I got the impression that they were actually going to be dismissed from the priesthood. I just got the impression that they were never going to be pope. Especially Adeyemi, specifically, Lawrence tells him, like, you can, I don't remember if he says you can continue with your role, but he just says you are never going to be pope. The impression that I got was that was it for the consequences. I mean, there might be more, but I don't think they said that there were going to be any more consequences. It's just that they're not going to be pope.
But the consequences for them going back to their parts of the world where they are the cardinal, the consequences may be, well, and Tremblay, we know for sure, is probably going to lose his job. He's going to be kicked out of the priesthood because he
might be, but I really did not get that impression with Adeyemi.
It could be, and it could be that he'll go back and be embraced by. It all depends on his parish, on his I don't know what they call it. It's not a parish, but whatever that is, he could lose it depending on what the people there think, and that's probably what it'll come down to. But otherwise, but his goal was to become pope, and he's not going to. That's a huge loss to him. It's horrible. So and we feel that for him, even as we know that he did a horrible thing.
So I wanted to talk about Benitez and also how his role in the plot kind of relates to his characterization, and his role in the plot kind of relates to gender in the Catholic Church. So he's played by Carlos Diaz. I don't think I've ever really seen him in anything before, but he does a great job as this character. Mm-hmm. So, I like Stanley Tucci, so I was definitely immediately a little bit on Bellini's side, but I just felt like characters kept saying that he was great, and I didn't actually see him do very much. But then, so the first thing that we learn about Benitez is first that he was named a cardinal in pectore, so in secret, and that's because he's in Kabul, so he'd be in danger. And then the next thing that we learn about him is that he spent years of his life helping women who are the victims of genocidal sexual violence. He helped to build a shelter for them or something. That's the very first thing, the very second thing that we learn about him after his existence, essentially. And at that point in time, we haven't actually heard any of the good works that any of the other cardinals have done. And honestly, by the end of the film, I don't even really, I like Lawrence and I like Bellini, but I don't really know what they've actually materially done. I mean, Lawrence has held this conclave together, but as much as Bellini is a nice guy and a liberal and seems to have his heart in the right place, we just don't really see him do anything outside of the conclave, and we don't know anything that he's done. But Benitez basically comes on the scene as this person who is voluntarily working in a dangerous place and has spent a bunch of his time helping women who are the victims of sexual violence. And then one of the first things that we actually see him do is he's introduced to the conclave in the middle of their dining hall and is given the chance to recite the prayer for them before they eat. And he does a quick prayer and they all start going to eat, but then he continues and he says, "And let us remember everyone who is not fortunate enough to be here. Let us always remember those who are less fortunate, and let us remember and thank the sisters who have done all of this work for us, who have created this food for us." At this point, we're 45 minutes into the movie at least, and no one has said thank you to any of the women, and the women are constantly silent in the background doing work for these men. And Benitez is the first person who thanks them. And you get a quick little shot of Isabella Rossellini, who at this point has not had a single line, and you just see her smile for just a second, because it's very clear that this is the first time that she's been thanked in a long time. So that's why Benitez was, from the beginning, as soon as he came on and he said that, as soon as we heard that the main thing he had done before was help women who were the victims of sexual violence, and then the next thing he did was acknowledge and thank the sisters who have done all this work, and all of the other men are like confused by this. And I was just like,
they just want to eat.
Benitez is my guy. Just from that moment on, I was like, I don't care about any of these other characters. This is the only man in this room worth it to me.
Well, and you know that it's a good point, because from what I understand, priests don't really praise the sisterhood, the nuns, and at all. They don't really. The woman, the famous nun from 20 years ago, who
Mother Teresa,
thank you, who was supposedly this. She's up for sainthood. She may have even gotten it by now, but it's almost like, I don't know. It's almost like they're jealous. The mother of the church is Mary. And the church was founded by a man, was founded by Peter, but it's founded in the name of Christ, who was born of a woman who is, Mother Mary is like this huge deal in the Catholic Church. But nuns are not. I've never understood it. It's beyond my comprehension. So, but it's like women everywhere. Women never get the credit that they deserve. Never have.
Yeah, nuns have so little power. I actually think another movie, I guess if we're just listing extended reading in the form of movies for this one, Doubt is a movie that really goes into the gender dynamics of the church. That's kind of what it's all about, the movie Doubt, which has Viola Davis in it. And I mean, the Doubt is like a master class of like all of the greatest actors of their generation. It's Viola Davis, Philip Seymour Hoffman, one of his last roles, and Meryl Streep are all in it.
Oh, I have to see this one. It's on my list.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen it in a long time, but it's called Doubt, and it's literally about kind of the machinations of the church and how these people are confined by their roles and how men have power and can use that power, and about how, you can devote your whole life to God and the Catholic Church and still have so much doubt. That's literally what the movie Doubt is about. But anyway, that brings me to Isabella Rossellini, who is in this movie. She was up for an Oscar. She was nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. I do think she does. Yeah, I do think she does a good job, but also it's a very limited role, and she literally does not have a line until an hour into the movie, and even then, as you said, she's got like maybe 20 total lines. It's an incredibly small role. She's basically the only speaking woman in the movie. And it is a pivotal role, because she eventually speaks up about Tremblay and is part of what is his downfall.
It's mostly facial expressions from her. Yeah. We see that the camera rests on her face many times, but she does not speak much.
Yeah, and for the first hour of this movie, I was like, I knew going into it that she's been nominated for an Oscar, and I'm just like, this is barely a role. Like, we're talking about Isabella Rossellini, who's like one of the most famous people alive. Like, and it felt very much like an example of when we nominate a seasoned actor who maybe hasn't won an Oscar for a role that they should have won it for, so we give them another nomination as sort of like
something that they wasn't very good.
Yeah, we're just and it's not that it wasn't good, it just wasn't much, like she did a good job, she just had about 20 lines. It's just very wild to me that such a small role earned her an Oscar nom, and I feel like it's just an example of, well, we just respect her as a person, so we're going to nominate her for an Oscar.
And I'll just jump in here really quick at the thing about the Oscars. First of all, we're not going to discuss all the Oscar-nominated films this year. We should have said that up front, but we're going to do a select few. And one of the criticisms of the nominations this year is they didn't truly reflect the films. So there are several supporting actor roles that should have been nominated for Best Actor, not Best Supporting Actor. And there were several people who are nominated, like Isabella, who, bless her heart, she was wonderful. But it was just not enough of a role to be considered for a Best Supporting Actor role when there were so many other women who should have been nominated.
Yeah.
So that was one of the criticisms this year, that there was just a mix-up kind of with who was nominated and who wasn't. And we've all heard the stories about how, well, it's how much they pay people or whatever to get nominated, or I don't know. And there's always some conspiracy theory out there, but this year it seemed a little mixed up on the nominations. I thought so.
Yeah. I think that also just reflects a lot about gender in this movie. This is a movie about the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has done a lot to repress women. It is one of the big oppressors out there, and it has not changed very much. It's changed a little. Now nuns can do a bit more grunt work than they used to, but they don't really hold positions of power.
It really has not changed.
Yeah, and as you were saying, like when I say that I was not interested in the content of this movie initially, that's part of it. I know that the Catholic Church is still an incredibly repressive power. So like I'm not personally affected by it because I'm not Catholic, and also I'm kind of morally opposed to the entire existence of the Catholic Church. So I go into this thinking this is going to be a movie about a bunch of gossipy old men in an institution that I think should not exist. And that's all true. And yet I still cared, and a lot of that was because of Benitez. Because as soon as Benitez showed up and said the things that he said, I was just like, that is actually a man who could change the Catholic Church if he were real. That is actually a man who understands that if the Catholic Church wants to be a force for good in this world, it needs to stand up for oppressed people, not aid in their oppression.
I knew it was going to be a hard sell when I saw the film and loved it. And I had the same similar reaction, that it started off slow, and by the time it was done, I was flabbergasted at the end of it. And I couldn't tell you because I didn't want to tell you the ending, but I knew this was a film you needed to see. So trying to find a way to get you to watch it when it was about old white men in the priesthood, I thought, well, hell, how am I going to
without spoiling it.
Without spoiling it. So I did my best, and thank you for listening to me and watching it, because it really was worth our time, I think. But one of the other things in this is it's a film about change. I mean, the church has historically resisted change. And they every couple of years or every couple of decades, sometimes you'll see articles in the New Yorker or the New York Times about how the church is being forced to change again, largely in the United States. Now, because other countries, I mean, some countries are as forward thinking as we have historically been up until these last 8 years. But mostly it's been in the United States, the concept of abortion and women's rights and giving nuns more agency. So all of that has pretty much come out of the United States.
I will also say I feel like we should give some credit to the Anglican Church and what is the
much
Episcopalians
more modern church,
the Anglicans and the Episcopalians, because they started a lot of these reforms. They were much earlier than the Catholic Church in doing reforms, and I'm not sure about the Anglicans, but Episcopalians have female priests. Women can rise to all levels of power in the Episcopalian Church, and I believe that's at least somewhat true in the Anglican Church as well.
Yeah, I don't know about the Anglican Church. I don't know.
I'm not sure if it's but the Episcopalians started off as a part of the Anglican Church.
An American version of it, yeah. So, the problem with change is that, so one of the things that the Catholic Church has had to do is it has had to survive. It has had to reach out and embrace diversity. It's had to go into Africa. They've had to go into countries and neighborhoods, not just countries, but neighborhoods in the United States, for example, where people live in poverty. And so the modern Catholic Church is in many ways a much more charitable organization than it has been historically. And because they realize if they don't do that, if they don't go into neighborhoods and countries and communities where they can help people, then they're not going to have the population to support the church. They
or the power.
They have to bring people in. You have to, and to do that, you have to embrace diversity. Well, when you embrace diversity, when you bring people with different moralities and people with different kinds of education, when you bring different viewpoints, when you bring people in, the more people you bring in who are different from you, the more conflict you're going to have. and the more likely you are to be forced to change. And that is what the Catholic Church has been facing. And then they kind of got sidetracked a little bit because with the whole thing with priests abusing young children, they were on their way to becoming a little bit more modern, and then they had this crisis that they had to deal with for a couple of decades. They refused to acknowledge it. They didn't want to get rid of these priests. And, that's a whole history we're not even going to get into. But anyway, they're just starting to come out. So this movie kind of comes in the middle of that, which I really love. But when you're talking about diversity, and he has a speech at one point where he's looking at the diversity in this room. And it's mostly white men, but there are, there's South American, there are Hispanic men in the room. There are black men in the room. But anyway, so Lawrence at one point, he gets a homily, and he's a little worried about this homily. He's writing it, and it's a prayer basically, and he's already said that he's having trouble praying. So he writes his homily where it's a speech and a prayer to the cardinals at the opening of the conclave, where he talks about God's gift to the church, and it's the gift of diversity of ideas and people, and that's what gives the church its strength. You can see that is true, and yet you can see how some of these priests in the room are probably thinking, no.
Yep.
That's not our strength. Our strength is that we are a community of white men holding power. Some of these priests feel that way, but the others recognize it, and Benitez is one of those.
Is one of them,
and so is Lawrence.
For sure. We've talked a little bit about Benitez. I'm now going to kind of roll into the ending. So if somehow you got this far without heeding our warning that you should turn this off, turn it off and go watch the movie. Anyway, so the explosion that happens towards the end is kind of the final turning point of the movie. Tedesco, the conservative, tries to use the explosion to his advantage. The explosion happens when they're literally casting the vote. Lawrence, in fact, is walking up and casting his vote. And there's an explosion that blows the windows in, and it's a very dramatic moment. And then we get a scene of them convening in a kind of theater-like room. I'm not sure what the real room is. And this is when Tedesco uses this as his opportunity to try to sway the vote his way. We never actually find out who caused the explosion or what the broader story is. We just know that 50 some odd people died and many more were injured. But Tedesco immediately blames the explosion on Islamic terrorists and claims that this is a result of the Catholic Church being too lenient and letting in too many voices and allowing Islam specifically to flourish, and that this is a sign that we need to go conservative, to give up all of these liberal inclusionary policies and go back to what works, because essentially, in his view, some people are better than others, and those are the people who should set the rules. At this point, Benitez gets up to offer a rebuttal, and he starts off by saying, "Forgive me, sir, but what do you know about war?" He basically says he has lived in actual active war zones, and he knows better than Tedesco that hatred is not the way that you end a war, that hatred just continues the cycle of violence, and that if we use this violence as a moment to basically turn hard right and cut out even more people, that we will just be creating even more violence. I'm not doing a very good job of quoting him. Well, it's a very eloquent and beautiful moment.
And he's also expressing something that has been told in the visual part of the explosion, because when they're sequestered, all the windows have been closed with these automatic, dark blinds. Lawrence says at the beginning of the film, I have a lot of priests who are going to be claustrophobically traumatized by this.
Yeah.
But basically they've got artificial light in this room because they've got the windows completely closed so that nobody can see any reflections, because apparently you can have reflections that will in some way they'd be able to determine what people are speaking. So, they're trying to keep it private and away from the public. But when the explosion happens, two of the windows are completely destroyed. The blinds are gone. The light literally comes in, so the outside world comes in. It's like the force of this explosion has brought the reality of the outside world into the lives of these prima donna priests who have been, they're taken care of. They're, what's the word I'm looking for? They have very privileged lives.
Yeah.
And the outside world, terrorists typically act out of desperation, because they live in poverty. They don't live privileged lives. So that contrast between whoever these terrorists are, and it's just like explosively brings them in. And so when Benitez gives this speech, you feel it because you've seen it happen literally.
And you can feel it in the room too, that everyone was being swayed by Tedesco, but then Benitez talks and they're swayed by him. And I think it's at that point that Bellini comes to Lawrence and tells him that he needs to get ready to be Pope because he thinks that the vote is going to swing towards him. But then the surprise ending is that Benitez is actually the one who gets elected Pope. And you can ask my partner, from basically the moment that Benitez first prayed in the dining room, Absolutely. I was like, I want Benitez. I want Benitez.
And he's going to get it. He's going to get it. In the Shoes of the Fisherman has the same thing, that the guy who was the most unlikely person, but the peacemaker. He's the peacemaker. And Jesus Christ was the peacemaker. And that's why it's appropriate for the Pope in the shoes of the fisherman, and Christ is actually the fisherman. Yeah. It's appropriate that the peacemaker becomes the Pope. And as soon as Benitez comes into the movie, I'm like, he's going to be the Pope. It's going to be him. We can just tell by his countenance.
I wasn't sure if it was going to be him or Lawrence. I thought there was a chance that it would end up being Lawrence because he spends...
it could have been Lawrence too.
Yes, he spends so much time listening to everyone's perspectives. But I'm glad that it's Benitez. And then we get our final surprise ending, which is that Monsignor O'Malley tells Lawrence that the medical procedure that Benitez ended up not going through with was going to be, I think they call it a laparoscopic, I might be saying this wrong, a laparoscopic hysterectomy. A laparoscopic hysterectomy. There we go. And then Lawrence goes to speak to Benitez about it, and Benitez basically says that he was raised as a man, and then after an appendectomy, discovered that he had a uterus and ovaries, and he had never known before. And then he was going to go and get this laparoscopic hysterectomy to get them removed, but he realized on the way there that perhaps removing the uterus that God gave him would actually be a sin, more of a sin than leaving it in, even though by church,
changing who God made him,
who and how God made him. By church doctrine, only men are supposed to become pope, and because he has a uterus,
only men are supposed to be priests.
Supposed to be priests. Yeah, and because he has a uterus, that makes him not quite straightforwardly just a man. I believe that, technically speaking, he's intersex. They don't go into super specifics, but he definitely presents as a man. He was raised as a man, and he also has a uterus. So I'm making this distinction because I want to be clear that he's not a trans man. He was not raised as a woman and then transitioned to be a man. He was raised as a man. He has lived his life as a man. He just found out much later in life that he has a uterus. This happens sometimes. Generally, we consider this to mean that the person is intersex. Sometimes it can mean that their chromosomes are the opposite of what you would have expected they were. Sometimes it means that they're kind of a mix. You know, you can have XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes. XX is generally straightforwardly a cisgender woman. XY is generally straightforwardly a cisgender man at birth. And then, being trans, you can have any kind of chromosome, and then you don't change your chromosomes when you transition. You just change your outward appearance. But the XX and XY dichotomy is actually an oversimplification of how our chromosomes can be. You can be XXY, you can be XYY, I think. There's a whole bunch of different ways that our chromosomes can be, and that often means...
We are diverse as humans.
Yes, we are diverse as humans, and that can often mean that your sex characteristics, your secondary sex characteristics, sometimes don't align with what your chromosomes would say, or sometimes they're a mixture of different gendered sexual characteristics. So all of this is to say that, when this reveal happens, it happens, they don't straightforwardly tell you exactly what's going on. You just see a conversation between Lawrence and Benitez. So at first I thought that we were revealing that Benitez was a trans man, but then I realized, oh no, he was raised as a man. He's just intersex. So part of what's happening here is, again, this conflict between modernity and tradition. Tradition holds that there are two genders. There's male and female, and only men can have power in the Catholic Church. But modernity means science, an ever-advancing medical science that is telling us every day that things are way more complicated than we ever thought. And that's what's happening here. 100 years ago, there's every chance that Benitez would never have found out that he has a uterus and is technically intersex. But we have much more advanced medical science now, and that's how we know that not just gender, but biological sex is a spectrum. It is not a one or two thing. We've known for a while that gender is a spectrum. The way you present, you can be, anywhere along a masculine to feminine spectrum. But the truth is that biological sex is that way as well. And I think this conclusion that Benitez comes to, that it's better that he keep his body the way God made him, speaks to what Lawrence was talking about how the Pope should live without certainty. The Pope should have doubt. The Pope
he should have doubt.
The Pope should be able to live with confusion and uncertainty, and be able to look to faith in that gap. And that is literally what Benitez is doing.
And also embrace diversity, because Benitez is a literal epitome of the human epitome of diversity.
Of diversity and uncertainty. Because his physical body is somewhere in between male and female.
Or I would say not in between, but both. He is both male and female in my mind. And to me, that is the perfect body to be the head of a church, leading both men and women in their religious teaching. And how do you do that? You have to be able to relate to both women and men. And who better to do that than someone who has female parts in his male body? They don't speak about this a lot, and you kind of didn't mention it, but he does say to Lawrence, I guess Lawrence is kind of questioning without speaking out loud, how did you not know this?
How did you not know?
He responds that there was a certain amount of modesty in the dressing rooms when, so he didn't look at other men, or other men didn't look at him, so he didn't know that he was different. But he's definitely different, and presumably could even become pregnant if he's got a uterus. And that's pretty extraordinary for a pope to be somebody who could become pregnant. So I just love the ending of this film. It to me, it embraces diversity in the natural world and acceptance. This man accepts himself as something that, I'm not a believer. I'm an atheist, even though I went to parochial school, I went to Lutheran school, was raised with religious beliefs, and I'm not a believer, but I love when he says that God created me this way. And the first thing that came to mind, bless her heart, is Born This Way. And I don't even know all the lyrics to it, but I'm just thinking, you were born this way.
God makes no mistakes.
God makes no mistakes, yes. So I love the ending of this film. It was perfect, and never saw it coming. Saw it coming. Great writing.
Oh, there ain't no other way. Yeah, I think it's also important that his body is a marginalized body, or the body of a marginalized person. He's a cardinal, so he is at this point living a fairly privileged life, even with all of the danger. But intersex people are not treated well by the medical establishment. I mean, we're getting better about it, but
you have to choose. You have to be certain. You have to be a man or a woman. You can't just be out there as something else. Yeah. And that is, getting to the politics of this, that is something that is out there in the American world right now. And it pisses me off, because the current president has specifically said that on your passport, if you're an American, it has to say if you're a man or a woman. It can't say anything else. Well, tell that to Benedict, what's his name? Benitez. Tell that to
Benitez,
Benitez.
yeah.
It's such an inhumane approach.
Yeah, it is inhumane, and there were decades. I don't think this is as widely practiced now, but there were decades in the middle of the last century where if a child was born visibly intersex, the parents were forced to choose which gender they wanted to raise their child as, and then genital surgery was performed on these infants. Absolutely barbaric. Inhumane.
And some places still do this. Now, sometimes I think anymore, they talk to them about you want to wait and see what he or she chooses and go from there. But I think the philosophy was it would be better to do it before they have any concept of who they are, and then you have to change that. Well, that's not how it works. You have a concept of who you are as you grow up. It develops. No matter whether you have a penis or a vagina, it develops. So that's a really back-assward way of looking at things. So.
Yeah. It's inhumane. I think it's inhumane.
It's inhumane
to perform genital surgery on a newborn child because you want them to conform to your idea of one gender or another, and to make their parents choose. I mean, how are their parents supposed to know what this newborn child is going to feel in 20 years? Insane.
And what if they choose wrong?
Exactly. Which, by the way, is the concept of the novel Middlesex. If any of you out there remember that novel by Jeffrey Eugenides, the novel Middlesex is about a girl who learns that she was born intersex and then realizes that she is actually a he, and he transitions to live as a man for the rest of his life. He has to transition because his parents made the wrong choice.
They made the wrong choice. Oh, so I would just like to take a few minutes to talk about the visuals and the filmmaking, which I think are just extraordinary. My first thought is just the saturation of color in this film is just amazing. There are a few scenes, when they're outdoors, there's this, in the very beginning, there are shots of some of the priests, and you see the diversity in the priests as they're standing up against the walls, and some of the walls are yellow, and then some of the walls are red, or they've got their red outfits on against the yellow, and it's gorgeous. There's a chess game at one point that Bellini and Lawrence are discussing. They see that the chess game is laid out, and they talk about it a little bit. And Bellini says he had an ongoing chess game with the Pope, and Lawrence asks him, how did that go? And he said, he was always 8 moves ahead of me. And I wrote in my notes, the whole movie is a chess game. Somebody is always 8 steps ahead. And that's kind of fascinating to me. But the visuals are just beautiful. In the first 2 minutes of the film, all you see is Ralph Fiennes. He's walking. The camera's behind him. He's not even wearing a skull cap at that point, I don't think. He's just, he's carrying it in his hand. It kind of shoots him from behind, and it kind of shoots his hands. You see he's clutching the skull cap, and you can hear his feet pattering, footsteps on the sidewalk. That's the opening. And because he knows the Pope has died, and that's where he's headed. And you can see when he clutches, we don't know the Pope is dead yet, but he does. And he's clutching the skull cap in his hand. There's a lot of tension in that. So he knows something is happening. So that's the buildup. That's our introduction. And then when they get to the room and they do all the ceremonial stuff with the body, and they cover it and they zip it up and they're praying, he's observing. He's looking at the room and seeing what things are in the room, the Pope's glasses, other things he's looking at, and he's not praying. And later on, he says that he is struggling with prayer. So this is the first indication we have of that. And I mentioned before the cardinals walking in looking like a bunch of penguins with their umbrellas. They're white in this first scene, and then at the end of the film, they're black. I don't understand what the difference is. But there's also like some close-up portraits of 4 or 5 of these cardinals and their various different kinds of robes that they're wearing, and there's a lot of diversity in this, but they're very colorful. Their clothes are all very colorful, and they take these slow, they're not photographs obviously, but they stand them up against the wall that is saturated with color. It's this deep yellow. It's a kind of rusty yellow, and there's color, like there are red walls later on in the deeply saturated red. There's just a lot of beautiful color in here. But then there's also the cardinals doing normal stuff. Some of them are smoking, some of them are on their smartphones, and there's also, they use some of those visuals to to signify a kind of arrogance, because when they all leave and they come inside, they show the cigarette butts on the floor of the courtyard, but they've just thrown them down. Somebody else will clean that up for me, and that's really arrogant. So after Lawrence's speech about doubt and faith, the camera pans to the cardinals, and you can see the very diversity he's speaking of in his speech. But also, these men are not moving a muscle. They are still as a painting. It looks like a painting.
Yeah.
So anyway, but also the contrast. So from the beauty and artistry of the Sistine Chapel, which also is kind of dark. I mean, they've got like we've said, they've got the blinds closed, and this beautiful, gorgeous room that usually has light streaming into it is dark. It's darkened, but it's still beautiful. There's marble everywhere, and this color from the.
But it's also so big. Like the ceilings are so high that it looks like a cave when it's this dark.
Yeah. So from that beauty, then you go outside to the decay of the courtyard. And it's beautiful in its own way, but there's it's dirty, there are plants kind of overgrown, and the turtles are walking through the courtyard. And that's
also
real thing.
The cigarette butts.
Yeah. And the cigarette butts, So that's all there. And all these men and women walking up and down the stairs. They have a couple of times when we see, just huge groups of men mostly, the cardinals walking up and down, a series of steps. And then we talked about after the explosion, the windows. After the explosion, the windows have not been repaired when they go back to vote again. And the wind is coming in because it's, it's moving papers and people's hair. And you can see it coming in along with the sound of the birds that are outside and the sunshine. So the real world, the natural world is coming into this conclave that they have, where they've sequestered themselves from the world. It's made its way in. You can't keep the world out. And in the final shot of the film, I don't really understand, but it is beautiful. It's beautifully framed. It's at an angle, so there's like a line in the middle of it, the building slashing up and to the left, and then you see those sculptures sitting against the wall, and all of them are different. They're all men, but they're each of them dressed differently, and they look like they might be different ethnicities. It's hard to tell because it's kind of a long shot, but there's diversity in the sculptures, and it's a very simple shot. It's just this wall and floor cut by the seam of the building and these sculptures along it. It's just a really beautiful ending to the film, to a film that has been beautifully filmed from beginning to end.
That's also something that happens right at the end. You're talking about the turtles. There's a shot where a turtle wanders inside, and Cardinal Lawrence picks it up and puts it back in the garden. And then there's this really wonderful shot of him standing in the garden. He almost kind of looks like he's floating because he's standing on like the ledge of the little pool, and they've got those long robes, so it almost looks like he's floating because he's like a little bit above the normal ground, and you can't very clearly see his feet. So he's got the beautiful garden around him, and then it's also framed by these like white walls because it's kind of shot through the entrance, and it just occurred to me that it's kind of a metaphor for what he did in this movie. That the turtle got lost and wandered out of the garden, and he picked it up and carefully put it back. He's the caretaker. Yeah.
He is the caretaker.
As that shot was happening, I think I was realizing he could never have become the Pope. That was not his role. His role was to take care of the papacy. He can't be the turtle. He has to put the turtle back.
And I have to think that also he will become an advisor to Benitez because he understands him. He understands the importance of the diversity that he represents. And maybe he can, even though he was thinking of resigning, I'm hopeful that he'll be able to help him in his papacy, help him be a good pope, be one for the ages. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's hope at the end of this movie, I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. It's a very beautiful, hopeful ending.
Well, and one thing we didn't mention is that at some point, there's an Italian cardinal. Is it Santi Tucci's character? But at one point, he quotes one of my favorite poems, The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. And he says, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. So it's one of the Italian cardinals is all I wrote down.
I think it's actually Tedesco.
Oh, it's Tedesco.
That.
Yeah, it is Tedesco. And actually, Yeats' poem is kind of about that, but it's about a lot of other things too. But he uses that as an example of why you have to, reject homosexuality and Muslims and women as priests and all the modern concepts that the liberals are in favor of. And
he's saying that the church cannot survive those concepts, basically.
Won't survive. Yeah, the center cannot hold. And so one last thing about the storytelling is that as the voting continues and Lawrence's number rises, we think he's going to be Pope. Sure. Until Benitez comes on, until we learn a little bit more about Benitez, he definitely seems like the one that seems like that's what the direction we're headed in. And then when he's asked by Tucci what his Pope name would be, he chooses John.
Mm-hmm.
And when they ask Benitez what he's going to choose, I thought he would choose Peter, but he chooses Innocent. Only how do you pronounce it in Italian?
Innocente.
So, and that's probably how they'll pronounce it. So, yeah, it's storytelling is lovely. The visuals are great. The writing is good. I think this is just a lovely, almost perfect film. So, do we have any hot takes?
My hottest take is just that I feel like Isabella Rossellini's role was too small to really be something that should be worthy of an Oscar. But, I also feel like I like Isabella Rossellini, and I do think she did a good job. So, I don't know. My hot take is kind of lukewarm. I'm a little bit mystified as to why this was the role that she got nominated for an Oscar for. But I also think it's probably just one of those things where we just give a respected actress an Oscar nod because she should have gotten it for something else or just because we like her. And I'm okay with that.
Everybody likes her. She's Ingrid Bergman's daughter. Everybody loves Ingrid Bergman. Everybody loves Isabella Rossellini. And how would you not? She's adorable, and she's a great actress.
She's great.
I mean,
she's fantastic.
Very charismatic, yeah.
I guess, unfortunately, my other hot take is that we should treat intersex people as people, and we should let them have control over their own bodies. And actually, there are more than two genders and more than two sexes. It is just a biological fact that we do not neatly divide into male and female. And I'm really glad that this movie spoke at least a little bit to that. I mean, it didn't go very deeply into it, but I'm kind of okay with that because I feel like a lot of people are going to get tricked into seeing this movie not knowing that it has this particular surprise waiting for them, and I'm hopeful that people are going to see it and are going to be forced to reckon with the fact that, both gender and sex are not as simple as we think, and whatever preconceptions you may have about either sex or gender, you may be wrong, and we should all live in a little bit more uncertainty.
Yeah. I have a couple of things to add to that. So my hot takes are, I loved the movie In the Shoes of the Fisherman, and I do think that the structure of that helped us to understand Catholicism a little bit better, and that's a little bit lacking here, but it's not a terrible thing. We kind of figure it out as we go along, and what we don't figure out, we probably don't need to figure out. So I think that's okay. I do wish Isabella had more of a role in it. I think she deserves Oscars for some of her work. I'm not sure this is one of them because she doesn't do a lot in this film. Yeah. If I had named the movie, I probably would have named it Nature of the Beast. And the nature of the beast has changed, I think. And I do kind of have to admit that I loved a lot of the formality and ceremonial stuff. I thought that was the way they did it was very reverential and respectful and loving, and I kind of like that. Just as a note, Ralph Fiennes was raised Catholic. I don't think he stayed with the Catholic Church, but it's unusual for a British actor to have been raised Catholic. And I was really impressed at how much of the Italian speeches he memorized completely. Maybe he had, learned to speak Italian somewhere else or something, but he did a great job with that. But here's a real hot take. They are sitting so close to each other in that conclave. How do they not see each other's votes? So that's a question. Because, they do. I mean, they're shoulder, they're elbow to elbow. So I think in the end, I just think that it's a film about the nature of change in institutional settings. This is a part of it, one of the themes. And the nature of change is you never know what you're going to get. What the outcome will be in the end, especially if the seeds of change are far-ranging and may not happen in your lifetime. You just never know what you're going to get. You never know what's going to happen. But especially when change happens in a culture or atmosphere where it is already festering, as it is in the Catholic Church, despite the need for some of its members maybe to cling to the past and to think the status quo. So that is pretty much all I have. So that, dear listeners, is all for today. This has been Women Inherit the Earth, a discussion podcast about women in movies from the perspective of a mother and daughter.
I'm Tessa Dare. You can find me at my website, tessadare.com, where you can sign up for my email list. Or you can follow me on Instagram and Threads at author.tess.adair. Or you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/womaninheritstheearth.
And I am Beth Von Buren. You can follow me on Instagram at STL_writer_Beth, on Blue Sky at STLwriterbeth.bsky.social. Or you can sign up for my weekly Substack email, Saturday Morning Musings, at stlwriterbeth.substack.com. Thank you for listening. Please join us again in about 2 weeks.